There's one night a year when the veil between worlds grows thin. A night we knock on strangers' doors asking for treats, while praying the wrong door never opens. They say the voices you hear on the October wind aren't just rustling leaves. They're whispers, echoes of real fears from nights that never ended. Tonight we will listen to 12 of those stories. True tales of what happens when the darkness of Halloween stares back. If you have the courage to hear what hides in the shadows, consider subscribing to Shadow Vault Stories. It helps our vault grow and release more nightmares. Now, lock your doors. Turn down the lights. The first story is about to begin. The first part of our Halloween special takes place where the danger should feel familiar. In the streets we walk, the farms we thought were dead, and the shortcuts we should have never taken. In these first tales, we enter places where the night offers no safety, only the certainty that you were never truly alone. The sound of your own footsteps in the dark can be a comfort, a steady rhythm in the silence. But the real terror begins when you realize one of those sets of footsteps isn't yours, and the shadow it casts is getting closer. The Halloween party was winding down, and the promise of my warm bed was more appealing than another lukewarm drink. It was just after midnight when I said my goodbyes. My apartment was only a 10-minute walk, a straight shot down familiar, tree-lined streets. I'd walked this path 100 times, but never on a night like this. A thick, wet fog had rolled in, swallowing the cheerful jack-o'-lanterns on people's porches and muffling the world in an unnatural silence. The streetlights were just hazy halos in the gloom, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe at the edge of my vision. I pulled my jacket tighter and started walking, my boots making soft, rhythmic taps on the damp pavement. For the first few minutes, the only sound was my own breathing and the distant echo of a car. But then I heard it. Another set of footsteps. They were faint at first, distant, but they fell into a perfect, unnerving rhythm with my own. Tap, tap, tap. I slowed down, pretending to check my phone. The footsteps behind me slowed down too. A cold knot formed in my stomach. It was probably just someone else leaving the same party. Nothing to worry about. I picked up my pace, walking a little faster, a little more purposefully. The other footsteps matched me instantly, closer now. Tap, 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 tap. The sound was heavier than my own, a solid, deliberate tread that spoke of weight and intention. I risked a quick glance over my shoulder. The fog was so dense I could barely see 10 feet behind me. There was nothing but an empty, swirling grayness where the sidewalk should be. But I could still hear them. They were there, hidden in the shroud. My heart started to hammer against my ribs. This wasn't a coincidence. I told myself to be rational. I crossed the street, my eyes darting into the oppressive mist. The footsteps followed, their sound momentarily changing as they stepped off the curb and onto the asphalt, then back onto the concrete on my side. They were mirroring my every move. Panic began to prickle at the edges of my sanity. I could feel a pair of unseen eyes on my back, a predatory focus that made my skin crawl. The shadows cast by the trees seemed to stretch and twist, no longer resembling branches but long, skeletal fingers reaching for me. My apartment building was just a block away, its familiar brick facade barely visible. Felt like miles. I broke into a jog, my breath catching in my throat. The footsteps behind me didn't hesitate. They immediately quickened, turning into heavy, pounding strides. It was a chase now. I fumbled in my pocket for my keys, my fingers clumsy and shaking. The metallic jingle sounded terrifyingly loud in the silence. I ran up the 3 short steps to the front door of my building, my lungs burning. The pounding was right behind me, so close I could almost feel the vibrations through the soles of my shoes. I jammed the key into the lock, my hand shaking so violently it took 2 tries. The lock clicked open. I threw myself inside, slammed the heavy door shut, and fumbled with the deadbolt, my back pressed hard against the wood. I could hear the footsteps stop just outside. There was a moment of absolute silence, so profound it was more terrifying than the chase itself. I held my breath, listening, my entire body trembling. I expected banging, shouting, something. But there was nothing. Just the thick, suffocating silence of the fog on the other side of the door. After what felt like an eternity, I slid down to the floor, relief washing over me in a dizzying wave. I was safe. It was just some creep and I had gotten away. I stayed there for a long time, just breathing until my heart rate began to return to normal. Finally, I picked myself up and started toward the stairs to my third-floor apartment. As I passed the small mailroom in the lobby, I glanced at the security mirror mounted in the corner of the ceiling. It was one of those convex ones showing a distorted, wide-angle view of the entrance. In the reflection, I could see the lobby, the staircase, and the front door. And standing in front of the door on the inside was a tall, slender shadow. It wasn't moving. It was just standing there, its form indistinct and wavering, as if it were made of the very fog I had just escaped from. It had no face, no features, but I knew with a certainty that froze the blood in my veins that it was what had been following me. It hadn't been trapped outside when I slammed the door. It had been my own shadow, and it had slipped inside with me. And now, as I stared at its reflection, it slowly began to turn its head, as if it knew I was watching. They say the pumpkins on the old Miller farm appear overnight, flawless and round, growing without vines. Locals whisper that it's a miracle, but they never question what strange nourishment the soil provides, or what is being harvested when the sun goes down. Every small town has a place like the old Miller farm. It sat on the edge of town, a sprawling plot of land that had been left to rot for at least 30 years. The farmhouse was a skeletal ruin, the barn had a massive hole in its roof, and the fields were choked with weeds. But every October something strange happened. A section of the main field would be mysteriously cleared, and dozens of pumpkins, perfectly round and orange, would appear, arranged in neat rows. No one ever saw who did it. The local legend was that Old Man Miller, who had vanished one Halloween night decades ago, still tended his patch from beyond the grave. Being an aspiring photographer with a love for local folklore, I decided the Miller farm was the perfect subject for a Halloween photo series. I went out there on a cold, overcast afternoon just a few days before Halloween. The air was still and heavy, carrying the scent of damp earth and decay. The place was even creepier up close. The pumpkins were there just like the story said. They were flawless, almost unnaturally so, glowing with a vibrant orange that contrasted sharply with the dying landscape around them. There were no vines, no stems, no sign that they had grown there at all. They just sat. As I walked through the patch taking photos, I noticed the scarecrow. It was positioned in the center of the field, a tall, haggard figure dressed in tattered overalls and a burlap sack for a head. Its button eyes seemed to watch me with a vacant, unnerving stare. I framed a few shots of it, the ominous figure stark against the gray sky. It was getting late and the light was starting to fail. I decided to get a few last shots of the dilapidated farmhouse before I left. As I focused my lens on a broken window on the second floor, I saw it. A flicker of light. A candle, maybe? My curiosity got the better of my fear. The stories all said the place was abandoned. I had to know what was going on. I approached the farmhouse cautiously, my boots crunching on dead leaves. The front door was gone, leaving a dark, gaping maw. I stepped inside, my camera hanging uselessly around my neck. The air inside was thick with dust and the smell of rotting wood. Furniture lay overturned and covered in cobwebs. But there were signs of life. A set of muddy boot prints, still fresh, led toward a staircase at the back of the house. And there was a smell, a coppery, metallic scent hidden beneath the dust. I followed the tracks to the staircase, my heart pounding a nervous rhythm against my chest. A soft, rhythmic sound was coming from upstairs. A slow, wet, scraping noise. Scrape, plus, scrape, pause. I took a deep breath and started to climb, the old wood groaning in protest under my weight. The scraping sound grew louder as I reached the top of the stairs. It was coming from a room at the end of the hall, its door slightly ajar. A warm yellow light spilled out from the crack. I crept closer, my body tense, and peered through the opening. The room was mostly empty, save for a single wooden chair and a small table with a flickering candle. But it was what was on the floor that made me freeze. A man was kneeling there, his back to me. He was hunched over one of the pumpkins from the field. In his hand, he held a long, rusty carving knife. With slow, deliberate movements, he was carving a face into the pumpkin. But he wasn't carving a smile or a silly grin. He was carving a face contorted in a silent scream, its eyes wide with terror, its mouth a perfect O of agony. And he wasn't just carving. He was using something to paint the inside of the mouth, something dark and red. The coppery smell was overwhelming in here. That's when I noticed the walls. They were lined with shelves, and on each shelf sat a finished jack-o'-lantern. There were dozens of them, each one with a uniquely terrified expression. But they weren't empty. Through the carved eyes, I could see something flickering inside. It wasn't candlelight. It was something softer, something that pulsed with a faint, biological light. I felt a wave of nausea as I realized what I was seeing. The legend was wrong. Old Man Miller never left. And he wasn't growing pumpkins. He was cultivating something else entirely. I backed away slowly, my hands shaking. My foot caught on a loose floorboard, letting out a loud creak. The scraping stopped. The man in the room went perfectly still. I didn't wait to see him turn around. I spun and bolted down the stairs, bursting out of the farmhouse and into the dying light. I ran through the pumpkin patch, not daring to look back. As I reached the edge of the field, I risked one last glance. The farmhouse was dark again. But something was different. The scarecrow, the one that had been in the middle of the field, was now standing at the edge of the porch, its burlap head turned directly towards me. And in the dim light, I could have sworn that its button eyes were glowing with a soft, pulsing light, just like the pumpkins on the wall. A shortcut is a promise of efficiency, a way to get home faster. But some paths are best left untaken. Especially those that cut through the silent, patient gardens of the dead, where not all who lie there are truly at rest. My car broke down. Of course it did. On Halloween night, in the middle of a country road I'd never used before, miles from the nearest town. My phone had no signal and a cold, relentless drizzle had started to fall. I could either sit in my dead car and freeze or I could start walking. I checked the map on my phone, useless for calls, but the GPS still worked. There was a small town, Blackwood Creek, about 3 miles away if I followed the road. But the map showed a dotted line, a footpath that cut straight through a patch of woods and came out on the other side of town. It looked like it would cut the walking time in half. The only catch: the path went directly through the old Blackwood Creek Cemetery. Normally I wouldn't have cared. A cemetery is just a field of stones. But on Halloween night, with the rain and the encroaching darkness, it felt different. Still, the thought of a warm hotel room won out over my unease. I grabbed my flashlight, zipped up my jacket, and headed for the woods. The entrance to the path was marked by a rusty wrought iron gate that groaned like a dying man as I pushed it open. The air inside the cemetery was colder, the silence more profound. Ancient, weathered tombstones jutted from the damp earth like crooked teeth, their inscriptions worn away by time. The rain pattered softly on the dying leaves, the only sound besides my own footsteps. I kept my flashlight beam aimed squarely on the path, trying my best not to look at the graves. but my eyes kept being drawn to the shadows, to the dark shapes of weeping angels and stone crosses. I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the undeniable feeling of being watched. I told myself it was just my imagination, my brain turning the spooky setting into something it wasn't. I tried to walk faster, but the muddy path made it difficult. My feet kept slipping and I had to slow down to keep my balance. That's when I started to hear it. It was a soft sound, almost lost in the rain. A faint, rhythmic scratching. I stopped, straining my ears. The sound stopped too. I started walking again and there it was. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was coming from somewhere off the path to my left. I swept my flashlight beam in that direction, its light cutting through the rain. The beam landed on an old, elaborate mausoleum, its stone doors sealed shut. The scratching was coming from inside. My blood ran cold. It had to be an animal, I told myself. A raccoon or a squirrel that had gotten trapped. It had to be. I tried to ignore it and kept walking, but the sound was soon joined by another. A soft, mournful whisper that seemed to ride on the wind. It sounded like a woman crying. The sound seemed to come from all around me, echoing between the tombstones. I was officially terrified now. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I started to run, slipping and sliding on the muddy path, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly, creating a dizzying dance of light and shadow. The whispering grew louder, closer, turning into desperate, pleading words that I couldn't quite understand. Then, my foot caught on an exposed root and I went down hard, my flashlight flying from my hand and extinguishing as it hit the ground. I was plunged into near total darkness, the only light coming from a sliver of moon hidden behind the clouds. Panic seized me. I scrambled on my hands and knees, frantically searching for my flashlight. My fingers brushed against cold, wet stone. A headstone. I was off the path. I had no idea which way to go. The whispering was right behind me now, a cold breath on my neck. "Help me," it sobbed. I screamed and crawled away, my hands sinking into the soft, muddy earth. I finally found my flashlight, its case cracked. I fumbled with the switch, praying it would work. It flickered on, its beam weak and stuttering. I pointed it in the direction of the voice. There, standing not 10 feet from me, was a woman. She was dressed in a tattered, old-fashioned white dress, soaked through with rain and mud. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes dark, hollow pits. But the most horrifying thing was her hands. Her fingers were worn down to bloody stumps, her nails completely gone. She was the source of the scratching. She took a step toward me, her empty eyes fixed on mine. "He buried me," she whispered, her voice a dry, rasping sound. "But he forgot to make sure I was dead." She lifted her ruined hands, reaching for me. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with a fear so absolute it felt like ice in my veins. The flashlight flickered and died for good, plunging me back into darkness with her. I could hear the soft, wet sound of her bare feet shuffling through the mud, getting closer and closer. I never found the path out of that cemetery. The legends are right. You're never really alone in a place like that. Some people are just waiting for company. On Halloween night, every door is an invitation, a promise of a treat behind a friendly smile. But this story is a reminder that some doors are dark for a reason. And what waits on the other side isn't offering candy, it's offering a trick. I was 8 years old and it was my favorite night of the year, Halloween. Dressed as a witch, complete with a pointy hat and a plastic cauldron for my candy, I was making my way through my neighborhood with my older brother, Ben. Our street was a loop, lined with houses that all looked vaguely the same in the dark. Every porch was decorated, glowing with jack-o'-lanterns and fake spiderwebs. We were on the last stretch, our bags heavy with candy, when we came to the old Withers house. It was the only house on the street that was completely dark. No decorations, no porch light, nothing. It sat at the very end of the cul-de-sac, looking like a dark, forgotten tooth. Everyone knew the stories. An old woman had lived and died there alone, and people said the house was haunted. Ben, being 14 and trying to act cool, dared me. "Go on, Lily. Knock on the door. I bet you're too scared." Of course, I couldn't back down from a dare. My pride was worth more than my fear. "I'm not scared," I said, trying to sound brave. I marched up the cracked walkway, my plastic cauldron bumping against my leg. The yard was overgrown, and the air felt cold and dead. I climbed the 3 rickety wooden steps to the porch and stood before the heavy, dark wood door. It had a large brass knocker shaped like a gargoyle's head. I hesitated for a second, my heart thumping in my chest. I could feel Ben's eyes on me from the sidewalk. I took a deep breath, grabbed the cold, heavy ring and knocked 3 times. The sound echoed loudly in the silent night. We waited. Nothing happened. "See? No one's home," Ben called out, sounding a little disappointed. I felt a surge of relief. I had done it. I turned to go, a triumphant grin on my face. And then I heard it. A faint, slow scraping sound from the other side of the door. It sounded like something heavy being dragged across a wooden floor. Ben heard it too. "Lily, get out of there," he hissed, his voice tight with fear. But I was frozen, my eyes glued to the door. The scraping stopped. Then, with a low, groaning creak that seemed to go on forever, the door began to swing open. It opened just a crack, revealing a sliver of absolute, impenetrable darkness. No light from inside, no shape, nothing. A strange smell wafted out, sweet and sickly like rotting flowers. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice trembling. There was no answer. But the door creaked open a little wider. I still couldn't see anything inside. It was like the house was a vacuum swallowing the light. "Trick or treat," I said, the words feeling foolish and small. From the darkness inside, a voice whispered back. It was a dry, papery sound, like leaves skittering across pavement. "I have no treats for you, little one," it rasped. "But you can have a trick." Before I could react, something shot out from the dark opening. It wasn't a hand. It was long and pale and thin, like a branch of a dead tree, and it wrapped around my wrist with surprising strength. It was cold, so cold it burned, and its grip was like iron. I screamed, a raw, terrified sound. I tried to pull away, but it was useless. It started to pull me, dragging me toward the dark doorway. "Ben," I shrieked. Ben snapped out of his fear-induced paralysis and ran, tackling me and pulling me back with all his might. It became a horrifying tug-of-war on the porch of that dark house. I could feel the thing's grip tightening, its coldness seeping into my bones. With a final, desperate heave, Ben managed to yank me free. We fell backward off the porch and onto the overgrown lawn. The pale, thin appendage whipped back into the darkness, and the heavy door slammed shut with a deafening boom that shook the whole house. We didn't wait around. We scrambled to our feet, abandoned our candy, and ran all the way home, not stopping until we were safely inside our brightly lit house, the door locked behind us. We never told our parents what happened. They wouldn't have believed us. But I'll never forget that night. I still have a faint, pale mark on my wrist where that thing grabbed me. And sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet, I can still hear that dry, rasping whisper in my mind. "You can have a trick." I know now that some doors are left closed for a reason, and you should never, ever knock on them. If you're still with us, you're braver than you know. You've survived the haunted streets, but the terror is just getting closer to home. The next stories are different. They aren't lurking outside. They're already inside, waiting in the objects you touch, the places you rent, and on the tapes that should never be played. Before we continue, if these stories are giving you the chills, help us spread the fear. Leave a like, share this video with someone who needs a good scare, and comment which story has gotten to you the most so far. Brace yourself. The next chapter takes place on the other side of the mirror. They say a house is made of walls and beams. Some are made of memories, but others are made of hunger. In these tales, we explore the terror that clings to objects and places, where a simple reflection can be a prison, and the only real ghosts are the ones still breathing. A mirror holds more than just a reflection. It holds a memory of every face that has ever looked into it. The problem with old mirrors, however, is that sometimes one of those faces decides to look back. I've always been a sucker for antiques, especially ones with a bit of character. So when I saw the mirror at a dusty yard sale on the weekend before Halloween, I had to have it. It was a large, oval-shaped mirror with an ornate, tarnished silver frame, intricately carved with vines and strange flower-like symbols I didn't recognize. The old woman running the sale gave me a weird look when I picked it up. "Came from an old estate," she'd mumbled. "Some folks say it's bad luck. Shows things that ain't there." I just laughed it off, paid the $20 she asked for, and hauled my new treasure home. I hung it in my bedroom directly across from my bed. It looked perfect, adding a touch of Gothic elegance to the room. For the first couple of days, everything was normal. I'd catch my reflection as I walked by, get ready in front of it in the morning, the usual. But then I started noticing little things. It began with movement at the edge of the reflection. I'd be sitting on my bed reading, and out of the corner of my eye, I'd see a shadow flit across the mirror's surface, a shadow that had no source in the room. When I looked up, there was nothing there. Just my own reflection staring back at me. I blamed it on a trick of the light, on my mind playing games with me. But it kept happening. The fleeting shadows became more distinct. Sometimes, it looked like a figure standing in the reflected doorway of my room, just for a fraction of a second, before vanishing. I started to feel a constant, low-grade sense of unease. I felt like I was being watched, not from the room itself, but from inside the mirror. The air in my bedroom grew colder, and I started having trouble sleeping. I'd wake up in the middle of the night with a jolt, my heart pounding, with the unshakable feeling that someone had been standing over my bed. When I looked at the mirror, it would just be my own terrified face staring back from the darkness. The real terror started a week later on Halloween night. I was getting ready to go to a friend's party. I was standing in front of the mirror, putting on my makeup. I was focused on my reflection, carefully applying eyeliner. I blinked, and for the briefest of moments, the reflection blinked back a half-second too late. I froze, my hand hovering in midair. I stared intently at my reflection, my heart starting to race. It looked exactly like me, but there was something wrong with its eyes. A coldness, a glint of something ancient and intelligent that wasn't my own. I told myself I was just tired, stressed out. I tried to dismiss it. I leaned in closer to the mirror, forcing a smile. "You're just seeing things," I whispered to myself. My reflection smiled back, but its smile was wider than mine. It was a predatory, unsettling grin that didn't reach its cold, watchful eyes. A wave of pure, undiluted fear washed over me. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. This wasn't a trick of the light. This was real. My reflection just stood there, holding that terrifyingly wide smile. It slowly raised its hand, the one that should have been holding an eyeliner pencil, but its hand was empty. It lifted its finger and drew a slow, deliberate line in the air, mimicking my earlier motion. Was mocking me. Then its smile faded, replaced by a look of profound hatred. It started to move, but its movements were no longer mirroring my own. It took a step to the left, its eyes never leaving mine. It was moving independently inside the mirror world. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was paralyzed, trapped by its gaze. The reflection walked to the edge of the mirror's frame, pressing its face against the glass. Its features began to distort, its mouth stretching into an unnatural shape, its eyes sinking into dark pits. It raised its hands and placed them flat against the surface of the mirror, as if it were a window. But the glass began to ripple where it touched, like the surface of water. It was pushing, trying to get out. I finally found my voice and let out a strangled scream. I grabbed the nearest heavy object, a lamp from my nightstand, and hurled it at the mirror with all my strength. The lamp in the reflection vanished a second before the real one hit. The mirror shattered with a sound like a gunshot, exploding into 1,000 glittering shards. The reflection, or whatever it was gone. I stood there, panting, surrounded by broken glass. The coldness in the room was gone, the oppressive feeling of being watched had vanished. I got rid of the pieces that night, throwing them into a dumpster miles from my house. I've never bought another antique again. But sometimes, when I catch my own reflection unexpectedly in a shop window or a dark screen, I flinch. I can't help but stare for a moment too long, checking the eyes, making sure they're my own. I'm terrified that one day I'll look into a mirror, and the reflection that looks back won't be mine at all. I'll see that wide, predatory smile, and I'll know that it finally found another way out. The perfect weekend getaway is a place of isolation, a quiet escape from the world. But in the deep woods, true silence is rare. And sometimes the feeling of being watched doesn't come from the forest, it comes from the room upstairs. There were 4 of us, me, my boyfriend Mark, and our friends Sarah and Tom. We wanted to do something different for Halloween, something other than the usual parties. So we decided to rent a cabin in the woods for the weekend. The place we found online looked perfect. It was old, rustic, and completely isolated, surrounded by miles of dense forest. The ad called it a perfect getaway from the city. Looking back, I should have paid more attention to the word getaway. We arrived late on a Friday afternoon. The cabin was exactly as advertised, a classic log structure with a stone chimney and a wide front porch. It was also undeniably creepy. The trees pressed in on all sides, blocking out most of the sunlight, and the air was still and silent. But we were excited. We unpacked, built a fire in the hearth, and broke out the board games. As night fell, the woods outside became a wall of impenetrable blackness. We locked the doors, more out of habit than any real fear, and settled in for the night. The first strange thing happened around midnight. We were all in the living room when we heard a noise from upstairs. A single, distinct footstep from the hallway above. We all froze, looking at each other. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered. Tom, ever the skeptic, laughed it off. "It's an old house, Sarah. It's just settling." It was a rational explanation, and we wanted to believe it, so we did. We tried to ignore it and went back to our game. But a few minutes later we heard it again. This time it was a soft, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floorboards right above our heads. Now, even Tom couldn't explain it away. The 4 of us were downstairs. There was no one else in the cabin. Mark grabbed a heavy iron poker from the fireplace. "I'm going to check it out," he said, trying to sound brave. We all followed him, huddled together as we crept up the creaking staircase. The upstairs was a short hallway with 2 bedrooms. The dragging sound had stopped. The hallway was dark and silent. We checked both bedrooms. They were empty, the beds neatly made, the windows latched shut. There was nothing out of place. Nothing to explain the sound. We went back downstairs, all of us thoroughly spooked. We tried to convince ourselves it was just the wind or an animal on the roof, but none of us really believed it. We decided to call it a night, hoping a good night's sleep would make us forget about it. Mark and I took one bedroom, Sarah and Tom the other. I had a hard time falling asleep. Every creak of the old cabin made me jump. I must have drifted off eventually because I woke up abruptly in the pitch-black darkness. What woke me was the cold. The room was freezing and the fire had long since died out. But that wasn't it. Something else was wrong. I could hear a sound in the room with us. A soft, wet, rhythmic breathing that wasn't mine and wasn't Mark's. It was coming from the foot of our bed. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, my eyes straining to see in the darkness. I was too terrified to move, too terrified to even breathe. I could feel a presence in the room, a heavy, malevolent stillness that made the air feel thick and hard to breathe. I slowly reached out and shook Mark's shoulder. He mumbled in his sleep. "Mark," I whispered, my voice barely a tremor. "Wake up. There's someone in the room." He sat up, groggy. "What are you talking about?" he whispered back. And then he must have heard it too because he went completely silent. The breathing at the foot of the bed continued, slow and steady. It sounded congested, labored. Mark fumbled for his phone on the nightstand, his hand shaking. He finally found it and turned on the flashlight, pointing the beam toward the foot of the bed. There was nothing there. The room was empty. But as the light hit the far wall, we both saw it. For a fraction of a second, we saw the shadow of a tall, stooped figure, its form hunched and distorted, before it seemed to dissolve into the darkness as the light touched it. At the same moment, the breathing stopped. We both screamed. Tom and Sarah burst into our room, woken by the noise. We told them what we saw, what we heard. No one slept for the rest of the night. We sat huddled together in the living room, with every light in the cabin turned on, waiting for the sun to rise. As soon as the first gray light of dawn broke through the trees, we were out of there. We threw our stuff in the car and left, not even bothering to lock the door. As we drove away down the long dirt driveway, I looked back at the cabin one last time. In the upstairs window, the one to our bedroom, I could see a figure. A dark, shadowy shape standing motionless, watching us leave. The ad was right. It was the perfect getaway. But we weren't the ones getting away. We were just temporary guests in a house that was already occupied. And whatever was in there was just waiting for the next group of visitors to arrive. In a haunted house, the fear is supposed to be fake. The screams are rehearsed, the monsters are actors in masks. But in this attraction, the line between performance and reality began to blur, starting with the one actor no one remembered hiring. I was a broke college student, and the local community center was offering decent money for people to work as actors in their annual haunted house attraction, the Blackwood Manor. I'd always loved Halloween, so getting paid to jump out and scare people sounded like the perfect gig. I was assigned to the asylum section, a long, winding hallway filled with strobe lights, creepy sound effects, and padded cells. My job was simple: hide in one of the cells, and when people walked by, lunge at the barred door and scream. Easy money. For the first few nights, it was a blast. The screams were genuine, the atmosphere was fun, and the other actors were all cool, mostly other students or local theater enthusiasts. There was one guy, though, who was a little off. His name was Arthur. He was an older man, gaunt and pale, with unsettlingly intense eyes. He worked in the cell directly across the hall from me. He took his role very seriously. His screams weren't just loud. They were filled with a raw, desperate pain that sounded chillingly real. He would throw himself against the bars of his cell with a terrifying violence, his body contorting in unnatural ways. He was incredibly effective. People would sprint out of the asylum section after passing his cell. One night, about a week before Halloween, I noticed that Arthur was even more intense than usual. His screams were guttural and raw, and he was thrashing against the bars so hard I was worried he'd hurt himself. The strobe lights flickered, catching his face in brief, terrifying snapshots. His eyes wide with what looked like genuine terror, his mouth stretched in a silent, agonizing scream even when the audio track was silent. I tried to catch his eye between groups of guests to give him a thumbs up or something, but he just stared straight ahead, completely lost in his performance. After my shift, I waited for him outside the actor's break room. I wanted to tell him he was doing an amazing job, but he never came out. I asked the event manager, a cheerful woman named Brenda, if she'd seen him. "Arthur?" she said, frowning. "He's a strange one. He never comes to the break room. He says it breaks the immersion. He usually stays in his cell until we close up for the night." I thought it was a bit weird, but I was impressed by his dedication. The next night, things got stranger. Arthur's performance was even more frantic. But this time, I noticed something else. The pre-recorded soundtrack for our section, a loop of screams, whispers, and clanging metal, started to glitch. Sometimes a new voice would cut through the mix, a low, rasping whisper that would say things like, "He's still here," or "Let me out." At first, I thought it was a new addition to the track to make it scarier. But the other actors I talked to hadn't noticed it. Then came Halloween night, the final night of the attraction. The place was packed. The energy was high. But in the asylum section, the air felt heavy, cold. Arthur was completely silent. He was just standing in the back of his cell, perfectly still, his face hidden in the shadows. It was somehow even more terrifying than his screaming. Groups of people would walk by, nervously glancing into his cell, and then hurry away, unnerved by his stillness. Halfway through the night, there was a power surge. The lights and sound in our section cut out, plunging us into absolute darkness and silence. We were supposed to stay in character until the power came back, so I stood still in my cell, waiting. The emergency lights, a dim red glow, flickered on after about a minute. And that's when I saw it. The door to Arthur's cell, which was always kept locked, was wide open. And Arthur was gone. A real, cold fear, completely different from the manufactured scares of the attraction, gripped me. I called his name. "Arthur? Man, this isn't funny." There was no response. Just the unnerving silence. I slowly stepped out of my cell, my heart pounding. The red emergency light cast long, demonic shadows down the hallway. I peeked into Arthur's empty cell. On the floor, scratched into the concrete, was a single word: "Help." Just then, the main power came back on with a loud hum. The strobe lights flashed, the screaming soundtrack blared, and everything was back to normal. Except Arthur was still gone. Brenda came running down the hall, her face pale. "We have a problem," she said, her voice shaking. "All the actors in the morgue scene, they're not moving. We thought they were just being professional, but they're not breathing." We all ran to the morgue scene, a section at the very end of the attraction. It was a cold, tiled room with several steel tables, each with a dummy covered by a white sheet. But tonight, they had used real actors lying on the tables for extra realism. They were all lying there, perfectly still under the sheets. The paramedics were already there. I heard one of them say, "No vital signs." All of them. It's like they just stopped. That's when I saw him. Standing in the far corner of the morgue, almost hidden in the shadows, was Arthur. He wasn't wearing his actor's costume anymore. He was wearing an old, stained orderly's uniform. And he was smiling, a thin, cold smile that didn't reach his intense, dark eyes. "The performance is over," he said, his voice a low, chilling whisper that I recognized from the glitched audio track. "Time for the real show to begin." He then turned and walked through a door marked "Staff Only" and vanished. We found out later that there was no such actor named Arthur on the payroll. No one had hired him. He had just shown up. The Blackwood Manor never opened again. They said the deaths were caused by a carbon monoxide leak, but I know what I saw. The asylum wasn't just a scene. He had turned the entire haunted house into his own personal playground, and we were all just part of the act. A home movie is a window to the past, a ghost of a memory captured on tape. But this tape was different. It showed a Halloween party from years before she was born. So why was she the one holding the camera? My grandmother passed away a few months ago, and my mom tasked me with the grim job of clearing out her attic. It was a treasure trove of forgotten things, a museum of a life well lived. Tucked away in a dusty corner, underneath a pile of old quilts, I found a small cardboard box. Inside was a single VHS tape. It had a handwritten label on it in my grandmother's familiar, elegant script. It just said, Halloween 1987. I was born in 1995. I had no memory of 1987, but my mom was a teenager then. I figured it was just an old home movie of her and her friends, and I was curious. My grandma still had an old VCR/TV combo in her spare room, so I took the tape downstairs, blew the dust off the top, and pushed it into the machine. The VCR whirred and clicked, and after a moment of static, an image flickered onto the screen. The quality was what you'd expect from an old home movie, grainy with washed-out colors and a wobbly handheld feel. It opened on a shot of a suburban living room, decorated for Halloween. Cardboard skeletons and orange streamers were taped to the walls. A group of teenagers, dressed in classic 80s costumes, were laughing and bobbing for apples. I recognized my mom immediately, her hair big and her smile bright. It was a sweet, nostalgic scene. The person holding the camera seemed to be part of the group, occasionally talking to people and laughing along. They walked through the house, filming people dancing, telling ghost stories, and generally having a good time. It was all very normal, very innocent. I watched for about 20 minutes, smiling at the sight of my young mom. But as the tape went on, I started to feel a strange sense of unease. It started with the camera work. The person filming would sometimes linger on odd things for a moment too long. A dark corner of the room, a closed door, their own reflection in a window. And in those reflections I could never quite make out their face. It was always obscured by a shadow or the glare of a lamp. Then I started noticing things in the background of the shots. A shadow moving in a hallway where no one was standing. A door creaking open on its own. Small things that could easily be dismissed, but together they created a growing sense of dread. The party started to wind down. People began to leave. The camera person followed my mom and her best friend, Sarah, as they went to sit on the front porch. They were talking about what they wanted to be when they grew up. It was a quiet, intimate moment. The camera focused on their faces, then panned down to the street, where a few late trick-or-treaters were heading home. Then it panned back up and into the house through the living room window. And that's when I saw it. For just a second, reflected in the dark glass of the window, I saw the person holding the camera. They were wearing a cheap plastic ghost mask, the kind you could buy at any drugstore. It was just a plain white mask with 2 black holes for eyes. A chill went down my spine. None of the teenagers at the party had been wearing a mask like that. The camera moved away from the window and back into the house. The party was over. The house was empty now except for the person filming. They walked slowly through the silent rooms, the camera lingering on the leftover party decorations. The footage became slow, deliberate, almost predatory. The tape should have ended there, but it didn't. The camera person walked up the stairs and down a hallway, stopping in front of a bedroom door. My mom's old bedroom. The door was closed. The camera stayed fixed on the doorknob for a full minute. Then a hand entered the frame. It was wearing a black glove. The hand slowly reached out and turned the knob. The door creaked open, revealing the dark bedroom inside. The camera moved into the room, panning slowly across the posters on the wall, the messy desk, the unmade bed. It felt like a violation, an intrusion into a private space. The camera then turned toward the large mirror on the closet door. It moved closer and closer until the reflection filled the entire screen. I could see the room behind the camera, the open doorway, and I could see the person holding the camera reflected perfectly. The cheap, white ghost mask stared back at me, its black eye holes like empty voids. The figure in the mirror slowly lifted its other hand, the one not holding the camera, and raised a single finger. It pointed directly at the camera, directly at me. My blood turned to ice. My heart felt like it had stopped. This tape shouldn't exist. This was a home movie. Who was this person? Why were they filming this? The figure in the mirror just stood there, pointing. And then the tape cut to static. I sat there, staring at the hissing screen, my mind reeling. I ejected the tape, my hands shaking. I had to know. I called my mom. "Mom," I said, my voice trembling. "I found a tape at Grandma's. Halloween 1987. Do you remember who was filming your party?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, strained. "We never knew," she said. "My friend Sarah, she disappeared that night. She went home from the party, but she never made it. They found her camera in the woods behind her house a week later. But the tape was gone." I dropped the phone. I looked at the VHS tape in my hand. It shouldn't have existed. It was a recording of a predator stalking its victim. And somehow, for the last 30+ years, it had been sitting in my grandmother's attic, just waiting for someone to press play. You've made it past the cursed mirrors and the houses that were never empty. If you've come this far, you're ready for the final chapter. The deepest dark. Now the terror becomes personal. It's no longer about places or objects. It's about the voices that know your name. The sounds that creep up the stairs when everyone is in bed. It's about the fear that finds you when you're at your most vulnerable. Before the final part, one last reminder. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Because after these final stories, you won't want to be alone in the dark when the next tales are released. Take a deep breath. The last voice of the night is calling for you. The most terrifying sound isn't a scream. It's a whisper in the silence of your room. One that sounds familiar. One that sounds like you. In these final stories, sanity unravels. The terror is no longer outside or on the other side of the glass. It's in your ear, on your phone, and perhaps in your own head. There is nothing more personal than the sound of your own name. But when you hear it whispered on the wind in the dead of night from the other side of your bedroom window, you realize it's no longer a greeting. It's a target. I live alone. It's a small one-story house on a quiet suburban street, the kind of place where you can hear a dog bark from 3 blocks away. I've always been a light sleeper, so I'm used to the normal nighttime sounds. The hum of the refrigerator, the groan of the house settling, the distant rumble of a late-night train. But last Halloween I heard something new. Something that didn't belong. It started just after I'd turned off the lights and settled into bed. A storm was rolling in and the wind was picking up, rattling the branches of the old oak tree outside my bedroom window. At first I thought it was just the wind, a high-pitched sighing sound that seemed to weave through the rustling leaves. But then, through the noise, I heard it. A whisper. It was faint, almost imperceptible, like a wisp of sound carried on the breeze. And it was saying my name. Anna? I sat bolt upright in bed, my heart instantly racing. I strained my ears, listening. There was only the wind and the rain, which had now started to patter against the glass. I must have imagined it. I was tired and my mind was playing tricks on me. Halloween does that to a person. I lay back down, pulling the covers up to my chin, and tried to force myself to relax. But I couldn't shake the feeling. I lay there for what felt like an hour, listening to the storm, my body tense. Then it came again, closer this time, clearer. Anna. It was a dry, sibilant whisper, like the sound of dead leaves skittering across pavement. It was coming from right outside my window. There was no mistaking it this time. It was a voice, and it knew my name. I slid out of bed and crept to the window, my body trembling. My window looks out over my backyard, which is surrounded by a tall wooden fence. There's no way for anyone to get back there without climbing it. I peered through a gap in the blinds. The backyard was a mess of swirling leaves and shadows, illuminated in brief, stark flashes by distant lightning. I couldn't see anyone. The oak tree's branches were thrashing wildly, clawing at the side of the house. The voice was gone. I stood there for a long time, watching, my breath fogging up the cold glass. Nothing. I finally convinced myself that it must have been a strange trick of the wind, the sound of branches scraping against the window pane somehow mimicking my name. It was a flimsy explanation, but it was the only one I had. I got back into bed, but I didn't sleep. I just listened. For hours, the only sound was the storm. I was just starting to drift off, my fear receding into a dull unease, when the whispering started again. This time it was different. It wasn't just one voice. It was dozens of them, all whispering my name in a discordant, overlapping chorus. Anna, Anna, Anna. They were all around the house now, coming from every direction, as if a crowd of people were standing just outside, their voices a constant, insidious hiss that wormed its way through the walls. Panic set in. This wasn't the wind. This wasn't my imagination. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't unlock it. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, turning from a whisper to a low, guttural chant. It was a sound of pure malevolence, a sound that made the hairs on my arms stand up. Then a new sound joined the chorus, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from my bedroom window. Tap, tap, tap. I looked over at the window, my blood running cold. In a flash of lightning, I saw it. A single, long, pale finger tapping against the glass from the outside. The rest of the hand and the person it belonged to were hidden in the darkness, but the finger was there, tapping with a slow, deliberate patience. I let out a choked scream and scrambled backwards, falling off the bed. The chorus of whispers outside erupted into a cacophony of dry, mocking laughter. I crawled into the corner of my room, pulling my knees to my chest, my eyes locked on the window. The tapping stopped. The laughter died down. And then a single voice, the same one from the beginning, whispered, so close it sounded like it was right beside my ear. "You shouldn't have looked, Anna," it hissed. "Now we know you're home." And I realized my mistake. The whispering, the tapping, they weren't trying to get in. They were just checking to see if anyone was listening. And I had let them know I was here. All night long, I sat in that corner and listened as they whispered my name, no longer from outside, but from the other side of my bedroom door. It starts as a game. A distorted voice on the other end of the line, making empty threats. But the game ends when the voice starts describing the room you're in, and the secret you've never told anyone. I hate prank calls. So when my phone rang at 11 p.m. on Halloween night with an unknown number, my first instinct was to ignore it. I was home alone watching a horror movie marathon, and I wasn't in the mood for some teenagers messing with me. But the phone kept ringing, insistent and jarring. With an annoyed sigh, I finally answered it. "Hello." "Hello, Mike," a voice on the other end said. It was distorted, run through some kind of voice changer that made it sound deep and gravelly like the classic movie villain. I rolled my eyes. "Look, I'm not interested. Find someone else to bother." I was about to hang up, but the voice chuckled, a low, rasping sound. "But the movie's just getting to the good part," it said. "You wouldn't want to miss it." I froze. I was in my living room and the TV was on. How could they know that? I walked over to the window and peered out into the dark street. I didn't see anyone. Very funny, I said into the phone, trying to keep my voice steady. My friends put you up to this, right? Is that you, Dave? The voice ignored my question. That's a nice shirt you're wearing, Mike. Blue really is your color. A wave of cold dread washed over me. I looked down at my shirt. It was a plain blue t-shirt. There was no way anyone could know that unless they could see me. I ran around the house, checking all the windows, pulling the blinds shut. My heart was pounding in my chest. This wasn't a prank anymore. Who is this? I demanded, my voice shaking. How can you see me? I have my ways, the voice rasped. I know a lot about you, Mike. I know you're afraid of spiders. I know you broke your arm falling out of a treehouse when you were 9. I know you still sleep with a night light in the hall. Every word was a hammer blow, a violation. These were things only my closest family knew. The voice knew things that were impossible for a stranger to know. How do you know these things? I whispered, sinking onto the couch. The distorted voice laughed again, a sound devoid of any humor. I know your deepest, darkest secret, Mike. The one you've never told a single soul. I know what you did to Timmy Peterson by the old creek back in 5th grade. My blood turned to ice. My phone slipped from my numb fingers and clattered onto the floor. It was a secret I had buried for 20 years, a shameful, horrible memory that I had never spoken of to anyone. It was impossible. I stared at the phone on the floor as the gravelly voice continued to emanate from it, tinny and distant. I couldn't listen anymore. I had to make it stop. I hung up the phone, my hands trembling. A moment of blessed silence. Then it rang again. Unknown number. I let it ring, my heart hammering against my ribs. It stopped and then immediately started again. Ring. Stop. Ring. Over and over. It was tormenting me. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I snatched the phone. Leave me alone, I screamed. But the voice on the other end was different this time. It wasn't distorted anymore. It was clear. And it was horrifyingly familiar. It was my own voice. But I can't leave you alone, Mike, my own voice said calmly from the phone. I'm already here. I threw the phone across the room where it shattered against the wall. The line went dead. I stood there, panting in the silent house. It was over. It had to be over. I took a deep, shaky breath, trying to calm my racing heart. I walked into the hallway, heading for the kitchen to get a glass of water. As I passed the large hall mirror, I caught a glimpse of my reflection, and I stopped dead. In the mirror, my reflection was standing perfectly still, but it was different. It was holding a phone to its ear, a phone that wasn't broken. And as I watched, paralyzed with a new, deeper kind of terror, my reflection slowly lowered the phone and smiled at me. It was a wide, cold, triumphant smile. And then I heard the whisper, not from the phone, not from outside, but from inside my own head. It was my voice, but it wasn't my thought. You should have never answered, it said. An old house has its noises, its creaks and groans that you learn to ignore. But some sounds cannot be ignored. Especially the sound of footsteps coming from a place where no one is supposed to be, and the silence that follows when they stop right below your feet. I was house sitting for my parents while they were on an anniversary trip. It was the weekend of Halloween, and I had invited my 3 best friends, Chloe, Liam, and Ben, over for a horror movie marathon. We were all piled onto the couches in the living room, a mountain of blankets and popcorn between us. My parents' house is an old 2-story, and the living room is directly above the basement. We were halfway through a particularly tense slasher film when Liam suddenly held up his hand. Shh. Did you guys hear that? We all went quiet, listening. The only sound was the movie's creepy soundtrack. Hear what? Chloe asked. I think I heard something downstairs, he said, frowning. Like footsteps. Ben scoffed. Dude, it's this old house making noises. And you're just paranoid from the movie. He had a point. The house was constantly creaking and groaning. We dismissed it and went back to the film. But a few minutes later I heard it too. It was unmistakable. A slow, heavy tread on the concrete floor of the basement right beneath our feet. Thump, thump, thump. It sounded like someone was pacing down there. I muted the TV. In the sudden silence, the sound was even clearer. All four of us looked at each other, our eyes wide. There was definitely someone in the basement. "Okay, that's not the house settling," I whispered, my heart starting to thud against my ribs. "Maybe your parents came home early?" Chloe suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. I shook my head. "They're in Florida. There's no way." The footsteps stopped. A heavy, oppressive silence seemed to rise from the floor. We all sat there, frozen for what felt like an eternity. Then we heard a new sound, a sound that made my blood run cold. A slow, scraping noise, like fingernails being dragged along the underside of the wooden floorboards, right beneath where I was sitting. Ben, who had been so skeptical before, was now as pale as a ghost. "We have to call the police," he stammered. I nodded, fumbling for my phone. But Liam, ever the thrill-seeker, shook his head. "No, wait. Let's just check it out. There's probably a raccoon that got in through a window or something. We'll feel stupid if we call the cops for a raccoon." I knew it was a terrible idea, but a part of me, the part that hated looking scared, agreed with him. Plus, there were four of us. What could happen? The door to the basement was in the kitchen. We grabbed the heaviest things we could find, a cast iron skillet for me, a heavy flashlight for Liam, and crept toward the door. I was last in line, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. Liam put his hand on the doorknob and looked back at us. He gave a nervous grin and then threw the door open, shining the flashlight down the steep wooden stairs. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the dusty, unfinished basement. It was filled with old furniture covered in white sheets, looking like a graveyard of forgotten things. We could see the whole room from the top of the stairs. It was empty. There was no one there. The small basement windows were high up on the wall, covered with cobwebs and securely locked from the inside. There was no sign of a break-in, no animal, nothing. A collective sigh of relief went through our group. "See? Nothing," Liam said, though his voice was still shaky. "Must have been the furnace kicking on or something." It didn't sound like a furnace, but we were all too relieved to argue. We were safe. It was just our imaginations running wild. I pulled the heavy door shut and the latch clicked firmly into place. We all started laughing nervously as we headed back to the living room, the adrenaline starting to fade. We sat back down on the couches and I unmuted the TV. We were all still a little on edge, but the fear was gone. A few minutes passed. Then Chloe frowned. "Wait a second," she said, looking around at us. "This is going to sound crazy, but where's Ben?" We all looked around. She was right. Ben wasn't there. He had been right behind me when we came back from the kitchen. I was sure of it. "Ben?" I called out, my voice trembling. "This isn't funny, man." Silence. A new, more profound fear began to creep back in, cold and sharp. Maybe he went to the bathroom? Liam suggested, but we all knew that wasn't it. The bathroom was just off the living room and we would have seen him go. And then we heard it again. Footsteps. But they weren't in the basement this time. They were coming from the kitchen. Slow, heavy footsteps, the same ones we'd heard before. And they were getting closer. I looked at Chloe and Liam and saw my own terror reflected in their eyes. We were frozen in place, listening as the footsteps came to a stop just outside the living room doorway. We held our breath. The person standing there wasn't my friend. I knew it with a chilling certainty, because as the figure of Ben stepped out of the shadows and into the dim light of the television, I realized something. When the four of us went to check the basement door, Only 3 of us had come back. A mask is meant to hide a face, but after the party is over and the mask is put away, it's supposed to stay still. This one didn't. And the knocking he heard wasn't at his front door. It was coming from inside the room, from a face that wasn't a face at all. After my Halloween party, I was exhausted. It was around 2 a.m. when the last guest finally left, and I did a cursory cleanup before collapsing into bed. The house was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator. As I was drifting off, I vaguely remembered someone had left one of their props behind. A strange vintage-looking mask. It was made of thick, painted plaster, depicting a pale, androgynous face with a serene, almost mournful smile and 2 dark, empty holes for eyes. I'd found it on the armchair in my study, and not wanting to just leave it there, I'd placed it on a small, decorative mannequin head I kept on my bookshelf. I was pulled from a deep sleep by a sound. A soft, rhythmic knocking. I groggily opened my eyes and looked at my alarm clock. 3 a.m. Exactly. The knocking came again, a little louder this time. Knock, knock, knock. It sounded like it was coming from my front door. With a groan, I threw back the covers. It was probably one of my friends who'd had too much to drink and forgot something. Annoyed, I shuffled downstairs. I peered through the peephole in the front door. The porch light cast a pale yellow glow on my empty porch. There was no one there. The street was silent and deserted. I figured it was just some kids, a late-night prank. I double-checked the deadbolt and went back upstairs, grumbling to myself. I had just gotten back into bed when the knocking started again. Knock, knock, knock. This time it sounded different. Not like it was coming from the front door, but from somewhere closer. It sounded like it was coming from downstairs inside the house. A chill traced its way down my spine. I sat up, listening intently. The house was silent. I told myself I was just half asleep, that the sound had been in my dream. But I was wide awake now, my senses on high alert. I strained my ears, listening for any other sound, any creak or groan that was out of place. Nothing. After about 10 minutes of sitting in tense silence, I decided I was just being paranoid. I lay back down, but I couldn't relax. Then the knocking started again. Knock, knock, knock. It was louder now, and there was no mistaking its location. It was coming from downstairs, from the end of the hall. It was coming from inside my study. My blood ran cold. The study door was closed. I was the only one home. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but I knew I had to see what it was. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could, grabbing the heaviest thing I could find on my nightstand, a glass paperweight. I crept down the hall, each floorboard seeming to scream under my feet. I stood outside the study door, listening. The knocking had stopped. A deep, unnerving silence emanated from the other side. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. I took a deep breath, turned the knob, and pushed the door open. I flicked on the light. The study was exactly as I had left it. The armchair, the desk, the bookshelf. Nothing was out of place. I scanned the room, my eyes finally landing on the bookshelf where I had left the mask. But the mask wasn't there. The mannequin head was bare. Panic seized me. I backed out of the room, my mind racing. Where did it go? Did someone take it? Was someone in the house? I turned to run back to my bedroom and lock the door, but just as I did, the study door slammed shut with a deafening boom. I was plunged into darkness. I fumbled for the light switch on the wall, but it wouldn't work. The bulb must have blown. I stood there, my back pressed against the wall, paralyzed by fear, listening to the suffocating darkness of the house. And then I heard it. A soft, scraping sound right behind me. Something was in the hallway with me. I didn't dare turn around. I could feel a cold presence at my back, could almost hear the soft, shallow breathing. Then the knocking started again. But it wasn't on a door. It was a sharp, hard rapping sound on the wall right next to my head. Knock, knock, knock. A low, whispery voice, dry as dust, spoke from directly behind me. "You shouldn't have opened the door," it rasped. My legs gave out and I slid down the wall to the floor, my mind shutting down from sheer terror. I could feel something cold and smooth brush against the side of my face. I squeezed my eyes shut. I didn't want to see it. I just wanted it to end. The last thing I heard before I blacked out was the whisper, its voice filled with a serene, mournful amusement. "Don't worry," it said. "I just want to see your face." When I woke up hours later, the sun was streaming through the hallway window. The study door was open. Everything was normal, except for the plaster mask which was sitting on the floor in front of me. And this time, its empty eye holes weren't dark. They were wet, and its serene, plaster smile seemed wider than I remembered. Halloween night ends, but the echo of the stories remains. The creak upstairs, the figure in the corner of your eye, the strange static on the phone. They were just stories, weren't they? Fear is a shadow. It follows you home and it waits patiently. It feeds on the silence and the doubts we've planted tonight. If you survive these 12 tales, you belong in our vault. There is more darkness waiting to be released, more whispers that need to be heard. Subscribe to Shadow Vault Stories so you won't have to face the next night alone. Until then, when you hear a noise in the dark, try to convince yourself it's just the wind. But never, ever answer if it calls your name.